People who are able to give feedback in a way that helps someone develop and grow have a special skill. It's this skill we'll be examining in this session. So the objectives of this session are that at the end of it you'll be able to explain the importance of feedback, analyse when feedback is useful in a mentoring session and when it's less than useful, and evaluate factors to consider when giving effective and valuable feedback in a mentoring session. Before we start, here are some things for you to consider and write down your answers. How do you define feedback? When is it of value? And when is it not so valuable? Here are some definitions of feedback. Feedback is information about the actual level and the reference level of a system parameter which is used to alter the gap in some way. That feedback is one person's perception of another. People are most revealing when offering praise or criticism. Praise indicates what they most like about themselves, and criticism often shows what they least like or feel least competent about in themselves, which means criticism is actually a two-way mirror. To feed information back to someone. This information relates to the person receiving the feedback and provides data from which they can assess their performance and experiences. So how do those definitions fit in with what you wrote down? How much is the feedback you give a reflection of yourself? When would you want to give feedback in a mentoring session? Well, here are some times when you might want to give feedback, but this is by no means an exhaustive list, so you may have thought of many other ones. Firstly, when it offers information the person has not thought of yet. So you may say something along the lines of, I've noticed in our sessions that every time we talk about working with Nigel, you are a lot more animated. What is it about working with him that makes a difference? In that sentence, you've given feedback about something you've noticed in the sessions and used it to ask another question that may help the client find new solutions. Another reason is when it will have a positive effect on their learning. I've noticed now that when you talk about doing presentations, you talk about them in a very different way than when we first met. What is it that you've learnt that's made the difference? Here again, we're using the feedback to ask another question, and in this case, using the feedback to help them notice what changes they've made. Feedback is also useful when they've asked for it, and it will have a positive impact. Sometimes clients will say something along the lines of, how do you think I'm doing? And sometimes answering this question can be encouraging and have a positive impact. It is sometimes best not to answer the question directly. In mentoring, your job is to do yourself out of a job, to leave your client being able to handle things when you're not there. Part of this can include that they're able to evaluate for themselves how they're doing, without having to always ask someone else. And lastly, feedback is useful when the person is displaying behaviour that's not useful for them to achieve their goals in the mentoring session. Sometimes people will display avoiding behaviour in a mentoring session, or they'll be running a strategy that's not helping them during the session. So you may want to say something along the lines of, I've noticed that every time I mention your college assignment, you change the subject. What is it about the assignment that triggers you into doing that? Even here, you'll notice you can use feedback to ask another question to discover more. Or it may be something like, when we get to the point of you choosing how you'll move forward, I've noticed you find a reason for not making a choice. What is going on when that happens? Here is an exercise to get you thinking about this a little more. Note 2 situations where you think giving feedback would be appropriate in mentoring. Then note 2 situations where you think giving feedback would not be appropriate in mentoring. Explain your reasons in all cases. So it's time to start thinking about approaches in delivering feedback. Here is an exercise to get you considering what is important in giving feedback. Please write down your answers. Firstly, think of a time when you have been given feedback and you found it not very useful. Then think of a time when you've been given very useful feedback that helped you learn and grow. What were the differences between the two experiences? What have you learned from this about giving useful feedback? And here's another exercise. Consider these different ways of giving feedback. If someone were to say, "You are hopeless at communication," or if they say, "You're no good at communicating with your team," or they say, "6 members of your team have told me that they didn't understand what you were telling them at the last meeting," or giving feedback by saying, "6 members of your team have told me that they didn't understand what you were telling them at the last meeting. What could you do differently next time to become even more effective?" What is the impact of each of these ways of delivering feedback? Here are some tips that may help with giving feedback. The first one is to ask the person to comment first. If, for instance, a client is telling you about what they've done since the last meeting, it would be important to ask them what they think had worked well and what things they may like to work on some more. Then it's important to offer feedback on observed behaviour, not on perceived attitudes, and offer a description of what you've seen or know rather than a judgment. If we take the example we used earlier, I've noticed in our sessions that every time we talk about working with Nigel, you are a lot more animated. What is it about working with him that makes the difference? You will hear that the feedback is about what behaviour was observed. That is, the person being more animated when they're talking about working with Nigel, and that's it. It's not saying, "I notice when you talk about working with Nigel that you're much more confident." If we say that, then we've mind-read that them being more animated means that they're more confident. That may not be the case. Next, focus on behaviour that can be changed. This means focus on things that the person has control over and is able to change. Then choose the aspects that are most important and limit yourself to those. Giving people huge lists of feedback and things that need changing is rarely inspiring. It's better to pick a few things that will have the biggest impact on the outcome that the client wants. Ask questions rather than make statements. As we've already talked about, it's advisable to use your feedback to build a question that will help the client find solutions, rather than making statements and leaving them unclear about what they're going to do about them. Then comment on strengths as well as areas for improvement. This and the previous tip are based on the premise that people don't like receiving feedback, and it's something you may like to think about when you set up the relationship with the client. That feedback is a positive gift that someone gets if they choose to use it that way. Their attitude to receiving feedback will be fundamental to the way you'll want to deliver the feedback and what you'll give feedback about. And lastly, before offering any feedback, consider if it is of any value to the receiver. When feedback is given in mentoring, then you may want to evaluate how useful is it going to be to help the client progress. Here's an exercise to help you explore about giving and receiving feedback. Find someone to work with and, considering all that you've learned on these modules, give them feedback on aspects of their performance. Get feedback from them on how helpful they found the feedback. And what's important about the way you receive feedback?